Hey folks, so getting right back into this, let's play around with our text a little bit. And I think what I'm going to do is I've already got the text written, so I'm going to take the type tool and I'm going to actually come over here and I'm going to click in between the two T's and hit delete and drop this down a space because I want to have two lines of type so I can talk about this further. So what we have here is we have four options that are really going to make a big difference when we're dealing with type. So the first option is going to be type size. So we can increase the font size by clicking on the up and down arrows right here on the toolbar, on the palette, the character palette. And I would like to also point out that everything that I'm going to show you today pretty much will be the same in Photoshop and in Illustrator and in Character Animator, and in if you still use Flash, it's the same, and pretty much every Adobe software. Muse, everything has these same kind of properties to it. So you learn it once, and it applies everywhere else. So it's actually, text is a great kind of tool because it's so similar across the board. So we can go ahead and do that. We can also use a drop-down menu, and we can pick from a bunch of predetermined sizes, and we can also go ahead and highlight and just type in here like 75, and that works too. Okay, so all those things can work. Next we have this thing here. This is called leading. Okay, now leading is the space in between lines of text. So in between the line that says point and in between the line that says text example. So it's this space right here. And it was originally defined because we used lead bars to put in between pieces of text like this, hence the word leading. And so leading, by default, is going to be 20% of whatever the text size is. So 20% of, if we add 20% to 50, we get 60, right? So it's always going to be that. And that is called default or auto, okay? Now, while that can work in some instances, a lot of times it just doesn't quite look right. And what I recommend is a simple kind of little formula. There's not a whole lot of science behind my formula, but it's a good starting point. And I call it the 5 up, 5 down rule. So the first thing you really want to do is you want to get your type size figured out, right? So 75, that looks pretty good. That's going to fill the space. I can read it. I like it. It works out really well. So okay, so then I'm going to come over here in my leading and I'm going to type in 75. So that's 75 point text and 75 point leading, right? So I'm going to make a duplicate of this 2 times, and I'm going to write right here 75, 75. And I'm probably going to change that to maybe, I'll do the solid phosphorus. Actually, I'm going to use something like Helvetica so it's easy to read. I'll take my... Perfect, okay. So this is 75, 75, right? And that's what we have here. So here, I'm going to take this top one here, and I'm going to say, remember I said 5 up, 5 down? So this is going to be my 5 down, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this 70. So I'm going to say 75, 70. And then I'm going to go ahead and make this one 75, 80. And, oops, I'll go ahead and I'll do that. So 75, 80, okay? So this just gives us an idea of a starting point and places that we can go. So here's our starting point, right here. Point text example, 75 points in size, 75 points in leading. Or we have this one here, 75 points in size and 70 points in leading. And then we have this one here, 75 point size, 80 point leading. Okay, so this is just a place to get you started. This rule is not a hard and fast rule. Like, you can definitely change this. In fact, if we were working in like 400 point font, for example, 395 and 405 would not be enough, right? But for the most part, we tend to work in like things that are under 100. A lot of times, even under 75 here. But if I take a look at 75, 70, that becomes a smaller relationship between this first line of text and this second line of text, and it works out. Okay, over here, 75, 75, it's larger than the one above it. It doesn't mean it doesn't work, but it's probably about space and a half. And then here, 75, 80, there's too much space in between that word point and these words text example. It's just too much. And it becomes somewhat of an issue. So when I look at all three of them out like this, now I can really see the differences between this one here and this one here. It's a noticeable difference. This one here kind of splits the middle, which is what auto does. So, or what it looks like usually when it's not what auto does, but what it looks like usually when it essentially it's the same. I'd like to point out one more time though. I'm going to make one more. So just move this up here. I'm going to move this up here. I'm going to make one more down here, right? I'm going to click on this, and here on my character palette for my leading size, I'm going to just click on auto, which we know is not in 20%, so it's going to be 90 in this case. And we'll just say auto. And now look at the difference between this thing and what the software gives us right off the bat. And this is what I was talking about in regards to respecting type and people just throwing things on there, because a lot of times they never ever ever play around with leading. They never experiment with it, and so you end up with a really big gap, and it doesn't read like this. To me, reads point text example, and this one reads point text example. Right? There's too much of a space inside of there. It's like William Shatner's talking, and that doesn't work out so hot. So you want to play around quite a bit, and you want to experiment quite a bit when you're dealing with leading. I'd also like to point out one other thing. These look the way they do because I'm using Phosphate, and Phosphate is a capital only font, and there's no ascenders or descenders, and the font size is measured from the bottom of the X height all the way to the cap height. So let's change this to a different kind of font. Oh, I don't know. How about Palatino? Let's change it to that. Does the 7570 still work? Yeah, I think so. The 7575 isn't bad either. The 7580 is starting to have a little too much text in there. But man, then we come back to the 7590 again. That's the auto, and it's like you could drive a freight train in between those two lines of text. It's too much. So you need to be aware of this, and you need to understand it, and just know that auto generally is going to be too big. And again, start at the same number as whatever your type size is, and then start going 5 up, 5 down. Maybe 5 up is too big, and maybe 5 down is too small. So maybe you have to find a sweet spot in between. Maybe 75, 70 doesn't work out, but maybe instead, just maybe, 75, 72 is that nice kind of sweet spot where the text is going to be readable. You want to be aware of that, okay? So this is like a sliding scale. It's not hard and fast. You can change things around, and it's definitely something that you want to experiment with for sure. And I recommend doing that. Instead of just jumping into an assignment, do what I just did. Go ahead, open up a page, blank page, throw a little bit of point text on it, put, throw a return in between so you get a couple lines of text, and just start experimenting more and more. Start doing it with other things too. So there is this pretty cool poster that I saw utilizing Helvetica Bold once. Actually, it wasn't a poster, I did that, but it was a t-shirt, and I want to say it was and John and George and Ringo. And I've actually seen this a bunch of times for other things too. I've seen it for like Harry and Ron and Hermione in Hogwarts. I've seen things like that. So anyway, if I go ahead and I start at 75 points here, and I start at 75 points for my leading, that got a little bit, that spaced it out a little bit more. When I think about what it looked like on the t-shirt and looked really effective on the t-shirt, they were pretty close to one another like this, like 60 points. Now I realize that's really kind of tight, but it worked really well on the t-shirt. And there's definitely some things going on here that don't work right now, and that's the spacing in between these letters and these ampersands and things like that. But essentially, this worked out okay as far as being readable. People were walking by me and I was seeing it, so it totally could work. Could I increase that leading a little bit more? Yeah, sure, absolutely. One of the things you have to be aware of is that you could have something, so I'll say poly, actually no, I'll say pliers, and then I'll use John. And this is an important thing to understand and realize, that sometimes you're going to have letters that are descenders, and then you're going to have other letters that are ascenders, and they might hit in the middle. And while the space in between these things kind of worked at 65 before, it 100% can't work now. So I've got to go ahead and I've got to make that bigger. And sometimes we will make decisions on how to lay these things out a little bit better. Now, instead of being left justified, can right justified help us out a little bit more? And it sort of can, but now we have another problem. The Y and the J are going to start hitting each other. So again, if I try to make this 5 down, look at that. So these are going to be things that will happen to you, and you're going to have to be creative to kind of solve these problems. They're definitely things that you can solve. Here, look, I just made that centered, and now it's not nearly as much of a problem. But when you're dealing with ascenders and descenders, leading does come into play quite a bit, and you have to be aware of that, because if you're not, you're just going to run into some issues. So please, just make sure that that's always going to be on your radar too. You can't always control the words that are going to come out on the paper. Sometimes a client gives them to you, and you just have to work with them. But what you can control is what those words essentially look like and how readable they're going to be in the end, by going ahead and massaging the type and working with font sizes and working with things like leading. We're going to take a closer look at things like kerning and tracking when we come back. So do yourselves a favor, though. Open up a plain piece of, I almost called it a plain piece of paper. Open up a fresh document, throw a little text on there and a couple lines, and just start experimenting with sizes and leading sizes, and see where it goes from there. Thank you.